Okay, now that we've configured line console 0 for access to the router, what we essentially have done is we've configured this port on the router, right? We'll take a look at it in the physical aspects here of the router, and we can see that we've configured this port right here, line console 0, that's the console port. So that's physical access to the router. So if I take this text tool here, we could even just label this, right? So this access right here, this is what we would call local access, right? Or physical access to the router. You need physical access to the router to be able to plug this console port into, or plug this console cable, rollover cable, into the console port of the router. So that's local access. It's also what we would say line console 0. Okay? So now what we need to do is we need to configure over here, coming off the Ethernet port, what amounts to remote access. And what we're going to be configuring here is line VTY, virtual terminal 0 through 4. 0 through 4 means we can have 5 terminal sessions connected into the router at any one time. 5 administrators could be connected into the router on line VTY 0, line VTY 1, line VTY 2, 3, or 4. Okay, and that is going to be remote access, and this is for Telnet and SSH, right? So that's what we're going to configure next. Now there is one more port that we could connect into the router if we wanted to, and that would be for, let's say, auxiliary port for a modem, which is also going to be a form of possible remote access because it's supposed to be connected to a modem. But in this case, if we're not planning on using it, then we shouldn't configure it, right? We shouldn't configure and enable interfaces that we don't plan on using. Okay, we configure line VTY much the same way as we did for line console 0. You need to be connected into the router for the first time you set this up, probably through your laptop. You would normally, as I've shown, you would normally hyper-terminal in by opening up your PC and opening up hyper-terminal or PuTTY and then getting terminal access to the router. But for the sake of this lesson, I'm going to just click on the router and go to the command line interface tab because it's easier to see. Alright, and we're going to need to type enable. Now let's just verify here that we've set up the router. Okay, we've set up line console 0 because the first time we connect to it, we have to put in a password. Right, so line console 0 has been configured. Now what we're going to do is we're going to configure line VTY. So I'm going to type enable, which gets me to privileged user mode. We need to put an enable password in on this too, so that we can't just easily get from regular user mode or user exec mode to privileged exec mode. So we'll do a configure tab completion, TER tab completion terminal. That gets us into global config mode. So now that I'm in global config mode, the commands are very similar to establishing line console 0. You're going to type line VTY space 0 space 4, hit enter. Now you're in configuration line command mode, and now you can type password Cisco. Of course, you're never going to use such a simple password as the name of the manufacturer of the device, but in this case it's just for an example. Password Cisco, and then type login, and then end, and now it's set up. So once you're back in privileged user mode, which is the # prompt here, you can do a show run, hit tab to see the full command, which is show running config. And you don't have to put in the full command, you can just type show run, hit enter, and you've got the running configuration file. And the running configuration file means that this configuration file is a configuration file right now stored in memory. If the router was to lose power and restart, this configuration file would not be saved and you would have to start all over. So I'm going to, you can see the more prompt here. I'm going to have to hit my space bar to go down through the configuration file, and at the bottom you can see that line VTY 0 to 4 now has a password Cisco and has the login command enabled. So now we are able to telnet into the router. Now, like I said, this has not been saved, so what we want to do is we're going to copy run tab. We want to copy the running config in memory, in RAM, and put space here and put STA and then hit tab to startup-config, which is the configuration file that is stored in NVRAM, which is non-volatile RAM. And so essentially what this command does is copy your running configuration essentially to your non-volatile RAM, which is going to save your configuration file. So now it prompts you, do you want to use the default name startup config? And for the purposes of this assignment, we'll just hit enter, which will take the default, and now we've saved our configuration file. Alright, now let's see if we can telnet into the router. So now that we've set up remote access, right, we should be able to telnet into the router from a PC on the network that's connected to the same network or has access to that network. So if this router here is located at, we've already configured the IP address to 192.168.1.1 right here, then we need to configure this PC so it can talk to this IP address. So we'll open up the PC. The PC also has tools for configuring it. Go to the desktop, IP configuration. We'll give it an IP address. We'll give it a subnet mask. We'll give it the gateway, which happens to be the router. Alright. And now we can test communications by opening up a command prompt and running a ping echo request to the router, which we can receive. So we've just tested layers 1, 2, and 3 on the network model. ICMP ping tests layer 3 and 1 and 2. So now that we've done that, what we can do is try to telnet in. We'll type telnet and we'll type 192.168.1.1, which is the IP address of the router. So now we're going to attempt to telnet in. We hit enter, and sure enough, it asks us for our password. We type Cisco, hit enter, and now you can see there's the prompt for the router. You can see it says Dan-R1, and we're now into the router. We can type enable, and you can see that no enable password has been set, so we're unable to actually get into privileged user mode. So something interesting happened when I tried to get into enable mode. I typed EN and hit enter, which should be for enable and get me into privileged user mode or enable mode, and I get a response from the router that no password has been set. So I'm unable to get to privileged user mode from Telnet remotely if the enable password has not been set on the router. So we need to do that next. So now what we'll do is we will pretend like we're consoling into the router from the laptop, but I'm actually just going to use the command line interface by clicking on the router so it's easier to see. We'll put in the password and we'll type enable. Notice how we can get in from console by typing enable and get to privileged user mode. Then we're going to type conft, which is short for configure space terminal, and that will get us into global config mode. Now we're going to need to put the enable password, so we'll say enable password Cisco. So we've set the password, the enable password, to the same password as the login password, which is not good security, but we're doing that right now just for, well, just to make things easy when logging in, but we'll have to change that. So enable password has been set. I'm going to now type exit, and I'll do a show run tab for running -config, and you can see there is the enable password right here, and we have line console 0 password and the VTY password. You can see all these passwords have been set. Now if we are in our PC and we decide that we want to telnet in. We put in our password, and we can type enable, and it asks us for the password, and now we're in privileged user mode from Telnet. So that was nice.